The search party found the tent first. It was a dark shape against an endless canvas of white, nearly buried by the driving snow. From a distance, it looked like a grave marker. As they got closer, the wind carried a sound, not a human sound, but the sharp, violent flapping of torn canvas. The entrance was sealed, frozen shut, but the side of the tent was slashed open, not with a knife from the outside, but clawed open from within. It was a desperate, violent exit into a storm that could kill a person in minutes. Inside, an impossible scene waited. The air was colder than the wind outside, still and heavy. Boots were lined up neatly by the entrance, as if their owners were about to put them on. Journals lay open on sleeping bags, their pages stiff with ice, a pen frozen to the last sentence. A pot of what looked like stew was sitting on a small stove, frozen solid mid-bubble. Food, fuel, warm clothes, axes, knives, everything a person would need to survive was still there. It was a shelter abandoned in a moment of pure, unthinking terror. But what could possibly be more terrifying than the blizzard raging outside? Why would anyone choose to face that kind of death without even putting on their boots? There were no bodies, not yet. Just the shredded tent and the howling emptiness of the Ural Mountains. This wasn't the Dyatlov Pass incident. This happened years before, a dark prelude to the tragedy that would later become infamous worldwide. But the mountain was the same. The lethal, biting cold was the same, and the chilling, unexplainable terror was the same. It was as if the mountain was practicing, honing its method for breaking the human mind before it took its most famous victims. The final diary entries are the key. They start normally, logging weather conditions, distances traveled, and daily rations. But then the tone shifts. The clean, confident handwriting becomes a frantic scrawl. The entries stop talking about the journey and start talking about a sound. It began as a low hum, a vibration they felt in their bones more than they heard with their ears. It seemed to come from deep within the snow itself, a constant, unnerving pressure. At night, it grew louder, making sleep impossible. They tried to rationalize it, wind moving through rock formations, shifting ice deep underground. But their own words betray their growing fear. One entry simply reads, "The sound is wrong. It doesn't stop." Then came the paranoia, the feeling of being watched. The hikers, a team of close friends, started to doubt each other. The journal mentions one man, Victor, who would stand outside the tent for hours, staring at a ridge they knew was empty. He claimed he saw movement. The others saw nothing but snow. Another entry asks, "Is the mountain making us mad, or was the madness in us all along?" Their equipment began to fail in ways that made no sense. Compasses didn't just point in the wrong direction, their needles spun in frantic circles, useless. Their maps, drawn by experienced cartographers, seemed to no longer match the landscape around them. It was as if the mountain was actively rewriting itself to keep them lost, to trap them in its white, featureless maze. This wasn't just a group of people lost in a storm. This was a story of a psychological collapse orchestrated by an environment that felt actively hostile. The mountain wasn't just a place, it was the antagonist. The wind wasn't just cold, it was a weapon, scouring away warmth and hope. The endless white wasn't just a landscape, it was a sensory deprivation chamber designed to break the mind, to make you see things that weren't there, to make you fear the friends sleeping next to you. They were experienced, they were prepared for the physical challenge, but you can't prepare for a place that seems to want you dead, a place that attacks your sanity first. What happened in those final moments? What drove them from the relative safety of their tent into the freezing jaws of the storm? The evidence they left behind only gives us terrifying questions, not answers. This case pushes the limits of what we understand about survival and the human mind under extreme pressure. To join us on more investigations into the unknown, subscribe to the channel right now. Now, to understand how this journey of a lifetime became a fight for survival, we have to go back to the beginning. The year was 1956. A full 3 years before Igor Dyatlov and his team would become a global obsession, their names etched into the history of the unexplained. But the mountain was already hungry. On these same unforgiving slopes, another group from the same Ural Polytechnic Institute was about to walk into a nightmare. Their leader was a woman named Valentina Utkina. In the world of Soviet mountaineering, she was a rising star. Not just experienced, but respected. She was known for her calm demeanor in the face of chaos, for her meticulous, almost obsessive planning. Her team was a reflection of her, 9 of the Institute's brightest and toughest. They were engineers, physicists, and athletes, all bound by a shared hunger for the extreme. This wasn't a casual trip. This was the ultimate test, a Category 3 expedition, the highest and most dangerous classification for a winter trek. Achieving it was more than a personal victory. It was a statement. It meant you were elite. It brought glory to your school and your country. The pressure to succeed was immense, and they thrived on it. Their target was the Northern Urals in the dead of winter, a place locals spoke of in hushed tones. A landscape of endless, blinding snow, where the wind cuts like a razor and temperatures plummet to levels that can freeze a person solid in minutes. They spent months preparing. They pored over military maps, which were often outdated and dangerously inaccurate. The pressure to succeed was immense, and they thrived on it. Their target was the Northern Urals in the dead of winter, a place locals spoke of in hushed tones. A landscape of endless, blinding snow, where the wind cuts like a razor and temperatures plummet to levels that can freeze a person solid in minutes. They spent months preparing. They pored over military maps, which were often outdated and dangerously inaccurate. Their target was the Northern Urals in the dead of winter, a place locals spoke of in hushed tones. A landscape of endless, blinding snow, where the wind cuts like a razor and temperatures plummet to levels that can freeze a person solid in minutes. They spent months preparing. They pored over military maps, which were often outdated and dangerously inaccurate. Their pressure to succeed was immense, and they thrived on it. They calculated every single calorie, rationing out blocks of lard, dried bread, and sugar. Their gear was the best the 1950 Soviet Union could offer, which by today's standards was terrifyingly primitive. Heavy wool coats that, once wet, would become a frozen shroud. Canvas tents that offered little more than a psychological barrier against the hurricane-force winds. Felt boots, or valenki, which were warm and light when dry, but became blocks of ice if moisture seeped in, a guaranteed death sentence from frostbite. They packed heavy ice axes, rudimentary skis, and a trust in their own strength. They believed they had an answer for every possible threat. They believed they were invincible. The mountain knew better. Their journey began at a remote logging village, the last flicker of civilization before the vast, silent wilderness swallowed them whole. The locals watched them go, their faces etched with a mixture of respect and concern. They knew things about this place that no map could ever show. For the team, however, the mood was electric. They were young, powerful, and standing at the threshold of their greatest adventure. The first few days went exactly to plan. Their recovered journals paint a picture of grueling but rewarding progress. They skied for 10 hours a day, the rhythmic crunch of snow underfoot the only sound for miles. They battled the biting cold, but their spirits were high. One entry reads, "The cold is severe, but the beauty is breathtaking. We are strong. We will conquer this peak." They were making excellent time, pushing deeper and deeper into the white emptiness, confident in their leader and in themselves. Then, the small things started to go wrong. It began with a ski binding. It snapped with a sharp crack in the deep cold, miles from any possibility of a proper repair. The group had to stop, losing precious daylight as they worked with numb fingers to fashion a crude fix. It was an annoyance, a delay, but it was the first crack in their perfect plan. A few days later, their compass began to act strangely. The needle, which should have been their unwavering guide, started to drift, then spin erratically. In a landscape with no landmarks, a place where every direction looked the same, this was more than just an equipment failure. It was a seed of pure panic. Were they going in circles? Were they already lost? They pushed the fear down and relied on the sun and stars, but the doubt lingered. The mountain wasn't just throwing physical obstacles at them, it was playing with their minds. The wind began to change. It no longer whistled, it seemed to moan, carrying sounds that felt disturbingly human. One of the final diary entries, scribbled in a shaky hand, captures the growing dread. The wind sounds strange tonight, not like wind at all. Something is out there. They were still moving forward, but the thrill of adventure was gone. It was replaced by a gnawing unease, a primal feeling of being watched, of being hunted. The journey was no longer about conquest. The struggle for survival had begun. Then their technology began to fail. First, it was the compass. The leader, a man who trusted his instruments more than his own instincts, stared at it in disbelief. The needle, their one certain link to the world they had left behind, wasn't just twitching. It was spinning wildly, a frantic, useless dance behind the cold glass. He tapped it. Nothing. He shook it. The needle spun faster. It was a toy, a joke. The mountain had just severed their lifeline. Compounding the horror, the sky offered no help. There was no sun, no moon, no stars. Just an endless, oppressive ceiling of gray cloud that blended seamlessly with the snow on the ground. They were inside a white sphere, with no up, no down, no direction. They were blind in a world without features. The feeling of being hunted now had a terrifying new dimension. They were also trapped. Panic, cold and sharp, began to set in. The leader's authority, once absolute, crumbled with the failure of his compass. His maps were now just useless sheets of paper. Arguments started, quiet at first, hushed and desperate inside the tent, then louder, angrier. Voices swallowed by the wind. "We have to go back," one of them insisted, his face pale with fear. "Back where?" another shot back, his voice cracking. "We don't even know which way is back." The accusations began to fly. Someone wasn't pulling their weight. Someone was using too much fuel for the small stove. A piece of dried meat went missing from a pack, and for an hour they were no longer a team of explorers. They were enemies, eyeing each other with raw suspicion. The unity that had kept them alive was cracking under the immense pressure. They were becoming a collection of terrified individuals, each one retreating into a private world of fear. The cold was relentless. It wasn't just a temperature, it was an active predator. It seeped through their layers of wool and canvas, a physical presence that stole the dexterity from their fingers and the warmth from their bones. Frostbite began its silent, methodical work. It started as a deep, burning ache in their toes, an ache they tried to ignore. Then the ache vanished, replaced by a terrifying numbness. Skin turned a waxy, dead white, then a sickening shade of black. Simple tasks became agonizing battles. Trying to open a food tin was a 10-minute struggle with hands that felt like clumsy blocks of wood. Lighting the stove became a desperate gamble against the wind and their own shivering. Hunger became a constant, dull ache in their stomachs. But the psychological toll was worse. The strange sounds in the wind continued, and now exhaustion was breeding paranoia. A shadow in the periphery of their vision would cause a man to jump, his heart hammering in his chest. Was it a rock, or was it the thing they felt was watching them? One of them, in a moment of panicked clarity, swore he saw a tall, dark figure standing on a distant ridge. He yelled, pointing with a numb finger. The others looked. There was nothing there, just snow and wind. They told him he was losing his mind. But the image was burned into his memory. Was it a hallucination, or was the mountain finally showing them what was hunting them? The group's journal entries became more fragmented. the handwriting more desperate, the scrawls of minds coming apart at the seams. One wrote, "I don't know who to trust anymore. The mountain is in our heads. It whispers when we try to sleep." Another entry, found days later, was even more chilling. "I saw it again. The tall shadow. It doesn't leave tracks in the snow. It just moves. The others pretend not to see it, but I see it in their eyes. They are just as afraid as I am." They were losing the fight not just against the elements, but against their own minds. The real enemy wasn't the cold or the starvation. It was the crushing certainty that they were not alone, and that whatever was with them on that mountain did not want them to leave. The breaking point came without warning. It wasn't a gradual slide into chaos. It was a sudden, violent snap. One of the men, the same one who saw the dark figure, began to tear at his own pack with frostbitten, clumsy hands. He was shouting, but the wind stole his words, leaving only raw, guttural sounds of pure terror. He was done waiting. He was going to walk. He didn't care where. Anywhere was better than this suffocating white prison. The leader grabbed him, trying to force him back to the ground, back to sanity. "Stay put. It's a whiteout. We'll die out there," he screamed into the man's face. But the man's eyes were wide and empty, the pupils blown out with fear. He wasn't seeing the leader. He was seeing the shadow on the ridge, an image now burned permanently behind his eyes. He shoved the leader back, a surprising burst of strength from a starving body. "It's coming for us," he hissed, his voice a dry crackle. "I'm not waiting for it." That was the spark. The group shattered. A third man, his face a mask of indecision, yelled, "He's right, we're sitting ducks here." The argument was no longer about maps or directions. It was a primal split between two kinds of fear: the fear of the known versus the fear of the unknown. Half the group sided with the leader, clinging to the fragile shelter of the tent as their only chance. The other half, infected by the contagious panic, decided to run. They believed movement was life. Staying still was a death sentence. There was no rational debate, just shouting, shoving, and a frantic, clumsy division of the last scraps of food and fuel. A bag of dried fruit spilled into the snow, lost forever. A single glove was dropped and immediately swallowed by the wind. It was a divorce born from terror. The ones who chose to leave didn't even look back. They simply turned their faces into the storm and stumbled away, becoming dark smudges against the white, then disappearing completely in less than a minute. For those left in the tent, a new kind of horror began. The silence left by the others was heavier and more menacing than any storm. They were fewer now, their collective body heat a pathetic defense against the plunging temperature. They huddled together, listening to the wind, each man locked in a silent, agonizing debate. Had they made the right choice? They were waiting for the storm to break, for the sky to clear. But the mountain had other plans. As if triggered by the group's division, the weather turned from hostile to apocalyptic. The wind, which had been moaning, now screamed like something being tortured. A blizzard descended with the force of an avalanche, burying the world in a churning vortex of white. The visibility dropped to zero. You couldn't see your own hand in front of your face. For the men who had walked away, the end was swift and brutal. They were not walking through a storm. They were being physically dismantled by it. The wind was a solid wall, shoving them, tripping them, scouring their exposed skin with billions of tiny ice crystals that felt like sandblasting. They were separated from each other in seconds, each man utterly alone in the roaring chaos. Their shouts were instantly erased. One man fell to his knees, the cold having finally frozen the fluid in his lungs. The others, if they even saw him, couldn't stop. To stop was to die. Their desperate hope to find a tree line, a cave, anything, was a fantasy. The mountain offered no shelter. It offered only a smothering, freezing blanket of snow. They fell one by one. Not from a single dramatic event, but from a simple, brutal equation: the body's heat versus the storm's cold. The cold won. They stumbled, fell, and did not have the strength to get up again. The snow covered them in minutes, erasing any sign they had ever been there. Back in the tent, the remaining survivors felt the blizzard's full fury. The canvas walls flapped with the sound of gunshots. The weight of the snow began to press down, causing the fabric to sag inward, making their world even smaller. The poles groaned, threatening to snap under the immense pressure. Snow was forced through every tiny seam, dusting their sleeping bags with a fine, cold powder that never melted. Their tiny stove, their last source of warmth, finally sputtered and died. They were plunged into a darkness so complete it felt physical, and a cold so profound it was freezing them from the inside out. Hope was gone. All that was left was the waiting and the sounds. Was that a scream they heard, carried on the wind? Or just the storm playing tricks on their minds? The desire to sleep was overwhelming, a sweet, deadly siren song. They knew what it meant, but fighting it took more energy than they had left. They had chosen to stay put, and the mountain had turned their shelter into a tomb. For days the storm raged, a relentless assault of wind and snow. And then, as suddenly as it began, it stopped. The world was left silent, buried under a thick, pristine blanket of white. The silence was absolute, heavy, and unnatural. When the first rescue teams finally pushed their way into the region weeks later, they were met with a landscape that seemed wiped clean, as if nothing had ever lived there. The search was a grim, exhausting process. The area was vast, and the snow was deep. For days, they found nothing but trees and rocks. It felt hopeless. Then, a sharp-eyed volunteer spotted something dark against the white. It wasn't a rock. It was a boot, sticking straight up from a snowdrift. As they dug, the horrifying reality emerged. It was a leg, frozen solid. The first hiker was found. That discovery broke the seal. Soon, they found another. This one was huddled at the base of a large pine tree, arms wrapped around himself as if trying to preserve one last flicker of warmth. He was miles from the group's intended path. Further on, they found a third, face down in the snow, his tracks showing he had been crawling in the final moments before the cold took him. The scattered positions of the bodies told a terrifying story of panic. The group hadn't just gotten lost, they had splintered. They had run, alone and desperate, into the teeth of the storm. Finally, one of the searchers stumbled upon a slight mound, a shape that didn't belong in the natural landscape. It was the tent, almost completely entombed by the blizzard. They had to use their knives to slice through the frozen canvas. The scene inside was even more disturbing than the chaos outside. The remaining hikers were there, tucked into their sleeping bags. At first glance, they looked like they were merely sleeping. The air was still. A half-eaten piece of bread sat on a plate. A map was laid out, a route carefully marked. It was a scene of eerie, frozen tranquility. This is where the story defies all logic. Why did some flee into a storm that meant certain death, while others stayed behind, seemingly resigned to their fate? The rescuers found their journals. The early entries were filled with optimism and descriptions of the challenging but beautiful terrain. But the tone shifted dramatically. The writing became frantic. They wrote about the weather turning against them with an unnatural speed. They wrote about equipment failing in inexplicable ways. And then they wrote about the sounds. A low, persistent humming that wasn't the wind. A noise that seemed to come from the mountain itself, getting inside their heads, fraying their nerves. The final entry was just a few jagged, illegible lines, as if the writer's hand was shaking too violently from cold and fear to form words. The official report was simple and clean. It concluded the hikers died from hypothermia due to extreme weather and a critical navigational error. But the men who were there, The ones who dug the bodies out of the snow never believed it was that simple. They saw the look in the frozen eyes of the man found by the tree. It wasn't just fear, it was sheer, unadulterated terror. This tragedy could have been just another sad story of adventure gone wrong, a local legend whispered as a warning. But it wasn't. It was a dark prelude, a dress rehearsal. Because years later, on another slope of this same mountain range, another group of 9 experienced hikers would meet an even more bizarre and horrifying end. Their tent would be found cut open from the inside. Their bodies would be discovered scattered, some without proper clothing, with inexplicable, violent injuries. The world would come to know it as the Dyatlov Pass incident. Those who knew of this first, forgotten tragedy felt a chilling sense of recognition. The mountain had a history, it had a pattern. It was as if this place was a predator, and it had tested its methods on this first group, learning how to dismantle human logic, how to turn a team against itself, and how to use isolation and fear as its primary weapons. What truly happened in those final, desperate hours remains a terrifying secret, a question absorbed by the snow and guarded by the unyielding silence of the Urals. This story is a grim reminder that some places in this world are fundamentally hostile to human life, holding on to their mysteries and refusing to give up their dead.
What do you believe was the final trigger for their panic? Was it just the relentless storm and the psychological strain of being lost, or did something else out there in the white emptiness push them over the edge? Let us know your theory in the comments below. And to make sure you don't miss our next investigation into the world's darkest unknowns, subscribe to the channel.